Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today we're embarking on, well, a really expansive and vital journey. We're exploring how Western frameworks have profoundly shaped our understanding of societies, particularly indigenous ones, and also the powerful, really inspiring ways indigenous peoples are reasserting their own rich political, social, and cultural realities. We've got a fantastic stack of sources guiding us for this deep dive. From Oironke Oyewumi's groundbreaking book, The Invention of Women, looking into Yoruba society, all the way to contemporary research on indigenous political thought in British Columbia, and the compelling story of Maori activism. Our mission today, well, is to unpack how deeply ingrained assumptions can distort our view of other cultures, to challenge the very foundations of what we often think of as, universal truths, and to highlight the incredible resilience and diverse wisdom embedded within indigenous knowledge systems. So let's begin this exploration.
Indeed. And it's really about consciously looking beyond the surface, isn't it? Beyond the categories we've just sort of inherited, and questioning the very lens through which we understand the world. What's truly fascinating here, I think, is how often our inherited ways of thinking, which are often rooted in very specific historical and cultural contexts, they get imposed as universal truths onto other societies. This inadvertently creates what we might call new traditions or even truth myths. We'll definitely see how this process has actively shaped and sometimes, distorted our understanding of diverse cultures.
Okay, so to really get to the root of this, let's start with a really compelling argument from Oironke Oyewumi's The Invention of Women. She directly challenges a fundamental, often unconscious, Western bias she labels body reasoning. Can you elaborate on what that entails?
Absolutely. So body reasoning is basically the assumption that biology inherently, almost automatically determines social position, roles, status, everything.
Right.
In Western thought, the body isn't just, physical. It's treated almost like a fundamental text, a storehouse of messages where social law is literally corporealized, made flesh, made inherent.
Right.
Think about how often we've seen this play out historically, right? From assumptions about women's natural roles in the home to historical legal codes treating men and women differently just based on perceived biological attributes. And this isn't just some abstract idea. It deeply shaped academic research. It made categories like women, which is a body-based designation, privileged, central even, even when analyzing societies where maybe that distinction wasn't primary at all. For instance, like a category like trader, which is a social and economic role that might get twisted into market women, as if the explanation for their job lies solely in their biology, their X chromosome. It completely overlooks the social, economic, or maybe age-based factors that truly define their role. It's a powerful bias. It distorts our entire lens.
Okay, so if body reasoning is this foundational Western assumption, Oyewumi argues that in pre-colonial Yoruba society, gender was not the primary social organizer. Instead, seniority, based on chronological age, that was the pivotal principle. This is where it gets incredibly insightful because she uses specific examples from the Yoruba language itself to illustrate this, well, radical difference.
That's right, and it's a critical distinction. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Yoruba language itself as a social institution, well, it's a carrier of its cultural values, its world sense. Unlike English, most names and all pronouns in Yoruba are ungendered.
All pronouns. Wow.
Yeah. For example, the third-person pronouns o and one. They distinguish between older and younger persons, not male or female. And one is specifically the pronoun of respect, used for anyone senior. This linguistic structure, it just reinforces a social order where age and seniority are paramount, not sex.
Okay.
And similarly, terms like Iya and Baba, they're often glossed simply as mother and father, but they're more broadly categories of adulthood, lineage, seniority, not just gender-specific parental roles. So this raises a really important question for us. What happens when you try to translate a gender-free language and worldview into a gender-saturated one like English?
It distorts it.
It inevitably distorts the meaning, and it imposes a Western framework, creating this sort of truth myth of gender where it wasn't socially dominant.
That's a profound point. It's not just semantics, is it? It's epistemological meaning. It fundamentally challenges how we understand and generate knowledge itself. The lack of appreciation for how language carries a people's world sense.
Yeah.
Well, it leads to the assumption that Western categories are universal. You mentioned obinrin and akunrin.
Right. In Yoruba, those terms relate to reproductive roles, not social gender as we think of it. And this distinction, it doesn't really extend to other realms like the farm or the ruler's palace. It's what Oyewumi calls a distinction without social difference.
Ah,
You might have Obingren who kneels, kunle, and Okuren who prostrates Dabal in greetings, but traditionally, prostrating was the preferred position for everyone. And even kneeling was linked more to the practicalities, the contingencies of pregnancy and age, not some inherent social valuation of gender.
I see. So it wasn't about inherent status.
Not in the way Western frameworks assume. This really brings us to how these Western biases weren't just theoretical ideas floating around. They were actively inscribed into history, into social structures, especially during the colonial period. Our sources really highlight how African studies itself has often been Westocentric, meaning research questions, theories, methodologies. They were often developed in the West, and then African societies were measured against a Western norm. This inherently places the West at the center of African knowledge production, which, marginalizes indigenous perspectives right from the start.
So what does this actually mean for the history we've been taught? Especially about, say, powerful figures in social roles. Oyewumi gives this powerful example of how Samuel Johnson, who was a key figure in Yoruba historiography, and Yoruba himself inadvertently patriarchalized Oyo history.
Exactly. Johnson's dynastic lists of Alafin, the rulers of Oyo, they largely just assumed the rulers were male. Any female rulers were treated as exceptions or maybe demoted to regents.
Which wasn't even a concept there.
Right. That's deeply problematic because traditionally inheritance devolved through consanguinal bloodlines, not conjugal ones based on marriage. So a royal consort like Iyayun, for example, she wouldn't have been allowed to take the throne in a regency role. That whole concept was alien to traditional Yoruba culture. The very act of writing history in a Western context, with its built-in biases, it reshaped the understanding of who could hold power. Some scholars even suggest that earlier Alafin were simply forgotten because they descended from the female line.
Really?
Yeah, later replaced by male line descendants in the historical accounts, essentially creating a nouveau roi, a new tradition of kings. It's a powerful illustration of how just writing history can itself be a political act.
Wow. And it wasn't just history writing that shifted perceptions, right?
Yeah.
Colonialism, through institutions like Christianity, Western education, new legal systems that fundamentally altered existing social dynamics too. How did these systems, designed by outsiders, reshape Yoruba society?
Oh, they were deeply transformative. Take the introduction of male-dominant Christianity, for example. It led pretty directly to the masculinization of Yoruba religious systems. While traditional Yoruba religion, like many African religions, didn't really articulate gender as a primary category for divinities or priests or ancestors, Christian theologians reinterpreted the supreme being, Olodumare, and the Orisa engendered, often exclusively male terms.
Using male titles.
Exactly. They used names like the pure king or king without blemish for Olodumare. These were heavily influenced by Christian and Islamic patriarchal traditions, not reflecting traditional Yoruba ideas of divinity. This wasn't just translation, it was a redefinition of the divine in gendered terms. And that then trickled down into social expectations.
And I imagine Western education played a similar role in shifting social structures.
Absolutely. Western education, initially anyway, it disadvantaged females. It was primarily geared towards creating clerks and administrators for the colonial government roles, largely reserved for boys. So this created a clear pathway for boys into colonial administration, into professions, while girls were often steered towards becoming housewives, reinforcing this domestic ideal that wasn't necessarily traditional in many African societies. And this also created a new demand for educated women to marry these newly educated men, shifting the value placed on girls' education towards, marital prospects and away from independent economic or leadership paths. It fundamentally altered societal expectations for women.
So these shifts also extended to really fundamental things like land ownership.
Yes, and this had huge, long-lasting consequences. Pre-colonial land tenure, often collective, managed by families or communities, that shifted dramatically. It moved to private, individual, and usually male ownership under colonial law.
Because the law defined only men as individuals?
Pretty much, yes. Only men as individuals capable of holding title in that sense. This effectively abrogated pre-colonial rights of access that women had simply by birth. This was particularly significant in patriarchal societies where a woman might not occupy land by herself. Colonial rule essentially established a new public sphere that was largely male-dominant. It overrode pre-colonial practices where women actually held significant leadership positions.
Right.
For example, in many societies, women held powerful political or economic roles, but these were just systematically undermined as political affairs became solely the province of male chiefs who were recognized by the colonial authorities.
Okay, so we've dissected how deeply these Western frameworks were ingrained and enforced. But the story doesn't end there, does it?
Not at all.
This historical context, it really sets the stage for the powerful resurgence we see today, where indigenous peoples are actively challenging these imposed structures and powerfully reasserting their own systems of governance and thought. Let's delve into how they're doing this, from decolonizing academic thought to, well, radical protests.
Yeah, and a critical perspective here comes from Sophie Clara Major's work on engaging indigenous political theories. She argues that Western political theory often adopts these unexamined traditions of belief and practice, things that implicitly assume indigenous cultures are generally apolitical.
Or just not nation-states.
Or that the nation-state is the only natural unit of political society. Yeah. These ingrained assumptions, they prevent meaningful engagement with indigenous political thought, because they frame indigenous aspirations as just claims to the settler state, rather than recognizing them as distinct, sophisticated political systems in their own right. This whole mindset makes it difficult for Western scholars to even see indigenous political theory for what it is.
Right, so instead of theorizing about indigenous peoples like they're objects under a microscope,
Exactly.
it's about engaging with their political thought directly, on its own terms. Taiki Alfred, the Kaininkiha scholar, he really pushes this idea. He challenges what he calls recognition politics, where settler states grant rights or sovereignty. He argues this approach often distorts indigenous cultures and actually aids colonial control by forcing indigenous nations into a settler legal and political box.
Precisely. Alfred advocates for a return to traditional indigenous political values and a post-sovereign future that rejects these non-indigenous political logics.
What does post-sovereign mean in this context?
Well, it isn't an absence of governance. It's about moving beyond the Western concept of absolute centralized state sovereignty. He envisions a future built on indigenous concepts like consensual decision-making, respect for natural law, reciprocal relationships, rather than the hierarchical power dynamics of the nation-state. True respect, in his view, means acknowledging the integrity and autonomy of indigenous nations on their own terms, not as subordinate entities just seeking recognition from some higher authority.
This raises a really important question, though. How do you challenge dominant narratives that are so deeply ingrained and often supported by official histories? The Maori activists of Te Waka-Huro, or TWH, provide a powerful example. They use radical protest to disrupt these colonial hegemonies. By challenging what they call truth myths, these distorted histories that present positive, often sanitized views of colonization.
Exactly. These truth myths, they might suggest pre-colonial Maori were somehow uncivilized, or that colonization was this benevolent process. A really powerful example TWH challenges is the differing interpretations of the Treaty of Waitangi.
The two versions.
Right. Most Maori chiefs signed Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Maori text. It used Kawanatanga for governance and explicitly reserved Rangatiratanga, which means chiefly authority or sovereignty for Maori. But the English text, the one often used by the Crown, ceded sovereignty to the Crown.
Huge difference.
A crucial difference. It means, from a Maori perspective, true sovereignty was never actually ceded. But this historical nuance often gets lost or, well, intentionally overlooked in official narratives.
So TWH's protests, which included actions like defacing museum exhibits that only showed the English text of the treaty. They weren't just random acts of vandalism.
No, not at all. They were calculated disruptions, designed to force the public to engage with these uncomfortable truths.
Okay.
They deliberately created a crisis of public attention around this truth myth that Maori had ceded sovereignty. And while public reaction was initially mixed, sometimes quite critical of their methods, these actions created a platform for experts to popularize a more accurate history and really confront cultural forgetting. It shows that sometimes, unpopular or even radical actions are necessary to bring critical issues to public attention, especially when official channels have failed to address historical injustices.
And we also see this kind of resistance growing in Canada, right? There was a study looking at Indigenous resistance from 2010 to 2020. It found an increasing frequency of highly visible acts, particularly contesting development projects like pipelines. Natural resource projects seem to be a major flashpoint.
That makes sense.
The second most common trigger for resistance involved criminal justice outcomes, like the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crises. Blockades are a common tactic, aiming to assert indigenous sovereignty and strengthen identity.
Hmm.
But these actions often come at a cost. The state's response frequently includes injunctions, arrests. It highlights the ongoing conflict over land and justice.
Absolutely. It's an ongoing struggle.
Okay, shifting gears slightly, let's pivot to some of the incredibly rich indigenous political theories emerging from these struggles, particularly one that offers a profound alternative to the Western, very rights-focused approaches to territory and land.
Indeed. The political theory of the Shishal Nation in British Columbia, as articulated by their Hawus, their traditional leader, it centers on the concept of responsibility to the land, rather than merely asserting rights over it.
Responsibility to it.
Yes. The Shishal creation story, for instance, talks about transformation young braves turning into wolves and orcas to find land for the people. This narrative beautifully illustrates the deep, inherent interconnectedness of spirit, humans, animals, and the land itself. If you look at their ancestral territory on a map, it stretches from mountains to ocean. It underscores this profound spiritual connection to place.
So it's not just about who owns the land or who has legal claims, but fundamentally about who is responsible for it and how.
Precisely. In the Shishal view, the ecological reality of interdependence places a moral and deeply spiritual responsibility on all inhabitants to steward the land. This includes chiefs ensuring clans uphold responsibilities to each other and to the land. Their practices like potlatches, for example, they serve as forms for interclan governance and feasting. Providing enough food for thousands of people at potlatch was a testament to a chief's success in upholding their responsibilities to the land and their people. Virtues like respect, integrity, commitment, they're paramount, not just for other humans, but for all parts of the land. It aligns with the idea that self-respect is intertwined with respect for others and the environment. This perspective really challenges Western theories of territorial rights. It suggests that responsibilities are reciprocal, collective, and maybe even prior to individual rights.
That's a powerful framework.
Mm.
And to understand these complex dynamics fully, especially within indigenous communities themselves, we can't ignore the importance of intersectionality, can we? How does that lens help us move beyond potentially universalizing indigenous experiences?
That's such a crucial point. Intersectionality, the framework exploring how various social categories like gender, race, class, sexuality, they all mutually constitute experience. It's vital here. It acknowledges that Indigenous women, for example, face unique challenges. Our sources note that Indigenous women are often the custodians of vital traditional knowledge, especially related to natural resources and climate. Yet, they are disproportionately marginalized in decision-making bodies. Their perspectives are often just invisible. Their priorities aren't considered. This leads to significant sociopolitical exclusion that's distinct from the marginalization faced by, say, Indigenous men.
So an Indigenous woman's struggle for land rights, for instance, it isn't just about being Indigenous. It's influenced by her identity as an Indigenous person and as a woman. And potentially other factors like class or age. It's not just one axis of oppression. It's the confluence of many.
Exactly. It highlights that relations of privilege and oppression are never simply binary. Some Indigenous scholars have, in the past, maybe noted a tendency within Indigenous studies to downplay gender issues, perhaps in an effort to present a unified front against colonialism. Understandable, maybe. But intersectionality provides a crucial lens to critically investigate power dynamics within and between Indigenous communities. It pushes us to think from both hand spaces, not just either. Recognizing the fluid nature of privilege and disadvantage within any group. It reminds us, I think, as scholars and as listeners, that we must be critical of our own standpoints and biases. Recognizing that claims about others are always political acts emerging from specific historical and cultural contexts.
Wow. What a journey through challenging these long-held assumptions. We've seen how deeply ingrained Western body reasoning and developmental historicism have shaped our understanding of societies, leading to the invention of gendered histories and the marginalization of Indigenous political thought. But we've also explored the powerful ways Indigenous peoples are reasserting their self-governance, their responsibilities to the land, and their rich, complex world senses through scholarship, resistance, and the revitalization of language and culture. It's really quite something.
It really underscores the idea that knowledge is most valuable, most meaningful, when it's understood within its own self-referent context, not imposed from outside. So our mission for you, our listener, is maybe to carry this critical lens forward. The next time you encounter a discussion about another culture, whether it's in the news, a book, just a conversation, maybe pause. Pause and consider the underlying assumptions being made. Ask yourself, whose categories are being used to describe this reality? What potential truth myths might be at play? And what alternative world senses might be present, just waiting to be understood on their own terms?